Alina Carter's world shattered. Lucas Sterling's voice echoed, cutting through the air. Lucas smirked, expecting her to crumble. But Alina did not break. She stepped forward. What she did next, no one saw coming. Alina Carter stood at the pinnacle of success. She had carved her empire from nothing, turning ambition into power. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night led her here. A wedding to Lucas Sterling, a man the world admired. But tonight, everything was about to change. Lucas lifted the microphone, his fingers tightening around it. His gaze, once filled with devotion, had turned cold. His voice carried across the grand ballroom, freezing every whisper, halting every movement. Gasps filled the air as an envelope slipped from his grasp, its contents spilling onto the pristine marble floor. Papers fluttered like shattered illusions. Someone stifled a gasp. Another reached for their phone. The weight of those documents was nothing compared to the truth they carried. Alina's pulse pounded in her ears. Her past, something she had buried so deep, was now being dragged into the light. Lucas smirked. It was not a look of shock. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of satisfaction. This was planned. Every moment, every detail, crafted for maximum destruction. She knew what the guests were thinking. Was she a fraud? A liar? A woman who built her success on deception? The whispers turned into a low murmur, each word a blade slicing through the moment. Could she lie about her past? What has she done? Who is she really? Alina clenched the bouquet in her hands, but she refused to tremble. She locked eyes with Lucas, searching for the man she once trusted. But he was not there. He had never been. Beyond the sea of faces, beyond the hushed voices, stood a figure in the shadows. Unmoving, watching. A shiver crept down her spine. Someone new. Someone had known before Lucas ever did. Phones captured every moment. The world was watching her burn. Lucas believed he had won. The guests believed this was the end of Alina Carter. But what none of them realized was that she had never been the kind of woman who broke. She was the kind who rebuilt. And tonight, she would make sure that when the ashes settled, Lucas Sterling would be the one left in ruins. What happened next? No one saw it coming. The ballroom was meant to celebrate love, not host a trial. The air was thick with expectation, the scent of roses blending with the soft murmur of anticipation. Alina Carter stood beside Lucas Sterling, her fingers lightly clutching the bouquet. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. Lucas raised the microphone, his grip tightening. His smile was gone. His voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the air. Before we exchange vows, let us tell the truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers slithered between guests like a growing storm. Alina's pulse pounded as she met Lucas's gaze. There was no warmth, no love, only triumph. A crisp envelope slipped from his hands, its contents scattering onto the pristine floor. Papers that should have remained buried. Documents that carried more than ink, they carried destruction. The murmurs intensified. Is that her name? Was it all a lie? A low, cruel chuckle rumbled from Lucas. His smirk was not one of anger, but satisfaction. He was not unveiling a secret. He was delivering a verdict. Alina inhaled sharply, forcing her hands to remain steady. He wanted her to panic. He wanted her to crumble. But she had spent a lifetime rebuilding herself from nothing. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Her mind raced. Who had given him these documents? Who had betrayed her? Beyond the glittering chandeliers and frozen faces, a shadow stood at the back of the room, unmoving, watching, a silent storm brewing in the distance. Her past had finally caught up. The room turned into a spectacle. Guests clutched their phones, recording the moment a love story turned into a scandal. They were no longer witnesses. They were judges. Lucas's voice dripped with mock sympathy. Alina Carter. Or should I say, someone else entirely. A sharp intake of breath. The walls closed in. This was no accident. This was a trap. She glanced at the documents sprawled across the floor. The truth they carried was nothing compared to the storm still waiting to be unleashed. Lucas thought he had won. The crowd thought she would break, but they had all underestimated her. She took a slow step forward, her voice calm, unwavering. "If we are telling the truth, Lucas, shall we tell yours?" The room fell into silence. No one saw it coming. Silence clung to the ballroom like a thick fog, pressing down on every breath, every heartbeat. Lucas flipped open the first page of the file, his smirk widening as his voice dripped with satisfaction. "My bride is not who she says she is." Gasps echoed through the room. A single name, foreign to the guests, hung in the air like a curse. It was not Alina Carter. It was something else, something she had buried. She kept her chin high, but her pulse pounded. The whispers started. "Who is she then? Is this true?" Lucas let the weight of the moment settle, savoring every second. He was not revealing a simple secret. He was tearing apart the very foundation of the life she had built. He lifted a page, holding it up for the crowd. She changed everything. Her name, her past, her identity. But the truth, he paused, eyes locking onto hers, has a way of finding us. A single breath could have shattered her, but Alina would not give him that satisfaction. Her fingers curled around the bouquet, knuckles whitening. The past she had worked so hard to escape had clawed its way back, and now it stood in the light for all to see. Lucas relished the silence. "So, Alina, or whoever you are, tell us, what were you running from?" She refused to look away. If he wanted to humiliate her, he would have to do more than throw out a name from a life she no longer lived. The guests leaned in, their curiosity turning into something darker. She could feel their judgment, their hunger for more. They wanted to see her fall. Lucas took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "You thought you were untouchable, that your past would never catch up to you. But here we are." Her lips parted, but no words came. She was not afraid. She was calculating. The revelation had come, but it was only his first move. He tilted his head. "Nothing to say?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Is this all you have, Lucas? A name?" He faltered, just for a second. It was enough. Alina took a slow step forward. The whispers faded into hushed anticipation. She would not let him control the narrative. Not now. Not ever. She turned to the guests, her voice calm but firm. "I built my life from nothing. I have fought for everything I have. I will not be shamed for surviving." Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "Surviving? Is that what you call it?" He tapped the stack of papers. "These documents tell a different story." Alina exhaled slowly. He was playing his hand too early. He was confident, too confident, which meant he had not found everything. Lucas wanted a confession. He wanted to watch her unravel. But Alina Carter did not break. She stepped forward once more, closing the space between them. "If you are so sure of the truth, Lucas," she said, voice steady, "then tell it." His smirk twitched. He had expected tears. He had expected fear. Instead, he found steel. A murmur from the back of the room caught Alina's ear. A shadow shifted in the distance. Someone was watching. Someone who knew more than Lucas ever could. She did not flinch. The room held its breath, waiting for the moment she would fall apart. Instead, she smiled. Lucas's confidence wavered. His grip on the papers tightened. This was not going as he had planned. She lowered her voice, just enough for him to hear. "You thought you had won. You thought this would end me." She leaned in slightly. "But you have no idea what you have just started." His jaw tensed. Alina straightened, facing the expectant crowd. "Let us continue," she said smoothly. "Or is there something else you would like to share, Lucas?" The balance of power shifted. Lucas had fired the first shot, but he had just given Alina her opening. A name she had erased, a past she had buried. Yet here it was, spilling onto the floor for everyone to see. Lucas stood motionless, holding the documents like evidence in a trial. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Let us introduce the woman you have been celebrating tonight, but not as Alina Carter. The crowd tensed. He lifted a photograph. She was someone else before this life, a different name, a different identity, a different past. Gasps rippled through the room. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Alina did not blink. She knew this moment would come. She had spent years preparing for it. But not like this, not in front of everyone. Lucas took another step, savoring the silence. She thought she could erase it all. That money could wash away the truth. But the truth is relentless. A single page slipped from the file, floating to the floor like a fallen verdict. It was an old record, one she had worked tirelessly to disappear. Alina clenched her fists. She knew what came next. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Who is she really?" Another voice, sharper, followed. "What is she hiding?" She had spent years escaping this, rebuilding, becoming something greater. But here, under the weight of 1,000 stares, she was being pulled back. Lucas glanced at her, enjoying the way the room turned against her. "Would you like to explain?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. She met his gaze with an unwavering stare. "Why do not you?" His smirk faltered. He had expected panic. He had expected tears. But Alina Carter did not break. He cleared his throat and turned back to the guests. "She was not always the woman standing before you. This wedding, this success, this empire, it is built on lies." Another page hit the floor. A record. A signature. A reminder of who she used to be. The crowd leaned in, hungry for more. Alina inhaled slowly. She had run from that name, from that life, and now it threatened to swallow her whole. But Lucas had made a mistake. He had turned this into a performance, believing himself the one with power. He had forgotten who he was up against. She took a single step forward, her voice calm but cutting. "If you have something to say, Lucas, then say it." The room fell into silence. He hesitated. She had spent years controlling her story. He thought he was exposing her. But what if she was the one setting the stage? It started with gasps. Shock rippled through the room, raw and electric. Then the whispers, low voices, darting glances, hushed speculations. She lied? Who even is she? Then the laughter came, cruel, sharp, a sound that turned the ballroom into a cage. The people who once admired Alina, who had envied her, now watched her unravel with delight. Their eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Their lips curled in amusement. A woman in a silk gown covered her smirk with a manicured hand. A man in a tailored suit shook his head, chuckling. Lucas stepped forward, fueling their amusement. "You all see it now, do you not?" His voice was smooth, controlled, dripping with false concern. This woman built an empire, but on what? A flash. Another. Then dozens. Phones lifted, cameras recording. The moment was too rich to ignore. Alina could hear it all. Every whisper, every taunt. The weight of their mockery pressed against her chest, suffocating. Lucas held up another page from the file. "She fooled me," he announced, voice theatrical. "Fool us all." The crowd leaned in, drawn to the spectacle. She felt their eyes, cold, hungry, waiting for the moment she would break. A voice from the crowd, bold and unashamed. "What else is she hiding?" Laughter erupted again, louder this time. A chorus of ridicule, echoing against the marble walls. Alina remained still, unflinching. She had spent years surviving. This was not the first time she had been cornered. It would not be the last. Lucas turned to her, reveling in the destruction he had created. "You have nothing to say." She lifted her chin, met his gaze, held it. A flicker of something flashed in his eyes. Uncertainty. He had expected tears, a plea, a collapse, but Alina Carter did not crumble. The laughter, the whispers, the flashing cameras, they were weapons. He had armed them all against her, but he had underestimated his opponent. She smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips. The laughter faltered. A beat of hesitation. The crowd hesitated. Lucas stiffened. She tilted her head. Are you finished? Silence. The shift had begun. The laughter echoed, but Alina was no longer hearing it. Her mind raced, searching for an answer. Lucas had uncovered a secret buried so deep, it should have been impossible to find. He was not smart enough to do it alone. Someone had helped him, someone who knew her past. Her pulse pounded as her gaze swept through the sea of faces. The wealthy, the powerful, the curious, none of them knew the cost she had paid to stand here tonight. But someone did. Someone had been waiting for this moment. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning for anything, anyone, that felt out of place. A familiar presence, a shadow from a life she had left behind. Lucas was still talking, but she barely heard him. His words were a dull hum beneath the storm roaring in her mind. Then, a flicker, a movement at the edge of the room. A man, still, watching. Her chest tightened. She knew that face. For a split second, the air seemed to freeze around her. Lucas had turned her wedding into a courtroom, and now, standing among the spectators, was someone who knew exactly what she had been running from. A cold realization settled over her. This was not just about humiliation. It was about control. Lucas wanted her broken, but the man in the shadows, he wanted something more. Her breath was steady, but her hands curled into fists. She could not allow herself to show fear. Not now, not when she was being watched. She forced herself to look away, back at Lucas, who was still playing the part of the betrayed lover. I had no idea who I was marrying, he said, shaking his head, voice dripping with fake sorrow. But now we all know. Another burst of laughter rippled through the guests. Alina turned her focus back to the man in the crowd. He had not moved. He was waiting. For what? Her past had caught up to her, but she was not the same woman she had been. She would find out who had betrayed her. And when she did, there would be no mercy. Lucas tilted his head, his smirk growing sharper. His voice was steady, but laced with something darker, amusement, control. My love, he said slowly, savoring every word, would you like to explain yourself? Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The room was waiting. The crowd, once enchanted by the spectacle of their perfect wedding, now leaned in, eager for the final blow. But this was not about truth. It was about power. Lucas had never wanted answers. He had wanted submission. His fingers tapped against the microphone, his patience stretching thin. Nothing to say, he mused, tilting his head. That is disappointing. The laughter returned, soft at first, then growing. Alina remained still, every fiber of her being demanding she hold her ground. This was a game, a carefully orchestrated show designed to reduce her to nothing. She had spent years carving a name for herself. He wanted to erase it in minutes. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, but ensuring the microphone captured every word. You built an empire on lies. You made yourself into someone you are not. And now the world will watch you fall. The air grew colder. Lucas's voice remained calm, but his eyes burned with something more sinister. Do you know what people hate more than a fraud? He asked, letting the question settle. A fraud who refuses to confess. A murmur rippled through the guests. Lucas wanted her to bow, to give in, to beg for mercy. But mercy was never part of his plan. Alina's hands clenched at her sides. Every breath was measured, controlled. Lucas took another step forward. Admit it, he said, his voice almost gentle. Admit who you really are. Alina looked up, her gaze locking onto his. This was his moment, his final move, and yet something in her stare made his smirk falter. She exhaled slowly. Lucas expected tears. He expected shame. But when she spoke, her voice was clear, steady. You are right. The laughter died. Lucas blinked. Alina tilted her chin up, refusing to let him own this moment. I did build myself, she said, but not for you to destroy. A hush fell over the room. This was not the reaction Lucas had anticipated, and he was no longer the one in control. Alina's breath caught in her throat, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on her. The past she had buried, the identity she had erased, it was all unraveling before her. Lucas stood before her, the master of this cruel performance, watching, waiting. Would she crumble? Run? Deny everything? No. Alina Carter had never been one to surrender. Her gaze swept across the room, searching for the face of the one who had betrayed her. Someone had helped Lucas. Someone who knew her past well enough to dig up what she had spent years destroying. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet. It was not just flowers in her hands. It was her last shred of composure. Lucas tilted his head, feigning sympathy. His voice was calm, controlled, yet laced with triumph. You are quiet, my love, he mused. That is not like you. More whispers, more murmurs. The guests, dressed in silk and jewels, relished the unfolding scandal. Alina swallowed the lump in her throat. If she faltered even for a second, he would win. She straightened her spine. You have worked hard for this moment, Lucas, she said, her voice steady. Go ahead, finish what you started. Surprise flickered in his eyes. He had expected tears, not defiance. Gladly, he smirked. He raised a hand, and more capers fell to the floor, a storm of her past scattered at their feet. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, turning to the crowd, meet the real Alina Carter. He paused, savoring the suspense. Or should I say, someone else entirely? The laughter came again. Cruel, cutting. Alina's mind raced. The room was a trap, but she refused to be the prey. She took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. If we are telling the truth, Lucas, she said, her voice unwavering, shall we tell yours? The laughter stopped. Lucas's smirk faltered. A single moment, a shift in the air. The guests leaned in, their curiosity twisting into something else. Lucas had been prepared to humiliate her, but he had never considered what would happen if she fought back. Alina reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a single folded document. A hush fell over the room. For the first time that night, Lucas Sterling looked afraid. A hush fell over the ballroom. The tension was suffocating, thick with anticipation. Alina's pulse steadied. The tremor in her hands faded. She would not break. Not now. Not in front of him. Lucas had played his move. He thought he had won. But he had underestimated her. She reached for the microphone, fingers curling around it. Slow, deliberate. If you want the truth, she said, voice unwavering, then let us tell it all. The murmur of the guests grew louder. Lucas's smirk faded. He had expected devastation. He had not expected defiance. Alina turned to face the crowd. The same people who had once admired her, envied her, whispered about her success. Now they waited for her downfall. Many of you have asked yourselves who I was before Alina Carter, she continued, and I'd have spent years ensuring that question would never be answered. Gasps rippled through the room. She was not denying it. Lucas crossed his arms. So, you admit it? She met his gaze without flinching. I admit that I built myself from nothing, that I had to bury my past to survive. But do you want to know the real secret, Lucas? She leaned in, voice just loud enough for him to hear. I knew this day would come, and I am ready. Lucas stiffened. He had prepared for humiliation. He had not prepared for this. Alina pulled out her own envelope. The guests whispered, another secret. You spent years digging for my past, she said, tilting her head. But while you were searching for my weakness, I was uncovering yours. Lucas' expression darkened. What are you doing? She stepped closer, holding up the document. You are not the only one who knows how to expose the truth. The room fell silent. Lucas reached for the envelope, but she pulled it back. Shall I read it? She asked, tilting her head. Or should I let them? The guests leaned in. The tables had turned, and everyone could feel it. Lucas clenched his jaw. You are bluffing. She smiled. Am I? A long pause. a single breath. Then Lucas did something no one expected. He stepped back. For the first time that night, Lucas Sterling was silent. And just like that, the power shifted. Alina Carter did not break. She rose. Lucas's smirk had been unshaken all night. He had controlled every moment, every reaction. But now something had shifted. Alina stood before him, unbroken, unwavering. The guests, once eager to witness her fall, now leaned in because they saw it. Power was slipping from Lucas's hands. He clenched his jaw. "You think you have won?" Alina tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. "I think I have already won." The audience murmured. This was not a woman destroyed. This was something far more dangerous. Lucas stepped closer. "You are bluffing." She held his stare, then call it. A silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Lucas inhaled sharply. His hands curled into fists, but his voice did not come. Alina had taken everything he had thrown at her and remained standing, and that terrified him. She turned toward the guests, scanning the crowd. Their expressions had changed. Pity had turned to curiosity. They were not looking at a fallen woman. They were watching the rise of one. She met Lucas's gaze once more, her voice steady. "The difference between you and me? You needed to destroy me to feel powerful. I never needed to destroy you to know mine." Lucas's breath hitched. For the first time that night, he faltered. Alina's pulse was steady, not from fear, not from panic, but from calculation. Lucas believed he had won. The audience believed she was cornered, but they had all miscalculated. She was not backing down. Her fingers curled tighter around the microphone. Every whisper, every judging eye, every smug smirk in the room, none of it mattered. Lucas tilted his head, his confidence flickering back, having nothing to say. Alina exhaled slowly, her voice calm. "I was waiting for you to finish." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Lucas frowned. "You think you still have control?" Her lips curved slightly. "I think you have spent too much time believing you did." Lucas's jaw tensed. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his gaze. Alina stepped forward. "You wanted to expose me, to humiliate me, but you never asked yourself the most important question." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "And what question is that?" Her voice did not waver. "What happens when I stop playing by your rules?" The crowd stilled. The shift in energy was unmistakable. Lucas had moved first, but now it was her turn. Lucas leaned in, his smirk widening. This was it, the moment she shattered. The audience watched with breathless anticipation, waiting for the inevitable collapse. A tear, a trembling lip, perhaps even an apology. But Alina Carter did not break. Her spine straightened. Her grip on the microphone was steady. If Lucas wanted her to crumble, he had underestimated her. Lucas chuckled, low and mocking. "Nothing to say?" Alina tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I was letting you enjoy the moment." A murmur rippled through the room. That was not what they had expected. Lucas's amusement flickered. "This is not a moment. This is your downfall." Alina exhaled slowly, her voice even. "You think power is in revealing the truth. It is not. Power is in how you own it." Lucas's smirk faltered. Alina stepped forward. "Do you want to talk about my past? Fine. Let us talk about yours." The audience leaned in. For the first time, Lucas felt it, control slipping through his fingers. And Alina, she was just getting started. The ballroom held its breath as Alina Carter took a step forward. One step, small, silent, but enough to shift the air in the room. The murmur of the crowd quieted. Phone still hovered, cameras still rolled, but the energy had changed. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes were steady. Cold, but not with anger. It was something sharper, certainty. Lucas's smirk twitched. "Brave, are we?" Alina did not answer. His amusement thinned. "Or are you just stalling, searching for words to fix what cannot be fixed?" Alina's voice was calm, I am not the one who was afraid, Lucas. A flicker of something crossed his face, almost too quick to catch. Almost. The audience waited. Alina tilted her head. You came prepared, did you not? Pages of my past. A spectacle to entertain your guests. You wanted them to watch me fall. Lucas exhaled a quiet chuckle. That was the plan. Then why didn't they look more interested in me than in you? A beat of silence, then another. Lucas glanced at the audience. Some still smirked, but others were leaning forward waiting, watching Alina, not him. Lucas scoffed. You are grasping at straws. Alina stepped closer. Am I? Lucas squared his shoulders, but his confidence was not as effortless now. Alina's voice softened. You expected me to fall apart, did you not? His jaw tightened. You counted on my shame, on my fear. You thought I would run, or cry, or beg. She exhaled, slow and controlled. But you made one mistake. Lucas did not speak. Alina's lips curled slightly. You underestimated the wrong woman. A hush settled over the room. Lucas's fingers tapped against the microphone. Fine. His tone was clipped. Then let us see just how strong you really are. Alina let the challenge settle. Then she smiled, and Lucas knew he had already lost. The tension in the room thickened as Alina Carter's voice sliced through the silence. If we are telling the truth, Lucas, shall we tell yours? The crowd inhaled as one. Lucas's confidence flickered, a barely there hesitation, but it was enough. Alina stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The weight of her words settled like a storm waiting to break. Lucas forced a chuckle. Are we changing the subject? Love? Alina tilted her head. Oh, I think the subject is just getting interesting. Lucas's fingers curled around the microphone, grip tightening. You are stalling. She smiled. Am I? The guests watched, waiting. The shift in power was undeniable. Alina's voice was steady. You wanted them to see me exposed. But here is the thing, Lucas. You forgot that I know you just as well as you know me. Lucas's smirk strained. Alina continued. You stand there, so sure of yourself. But I wonder, if they saw you without the mask, would they still admire you? The murmur of the crowd returned, quieter this time, but filled with curiosity. Lucas's jaw clenched. You are bluffing. Alina's gaze did not waver. Do you want to find out? Silence. Then she took one final step forward, looking him in the eyes. You set a fire, Lucas, she murmured, but you forgot. I do not burn. And for the first time that night, Lucas took a step back. The hush in the ballroom deepened as Alina Carter reached into the folds of her gown. The weight in her fingers was not just paper, it was power. Lucas had come prepared to destroy her, but he had underestimated the woman he was up against. A single sheet slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the floor. The guests leaned in, their curiosity burned through the silence. Lucas's smirk tightened. What is this? Alina met his gaze. A contract, one you signed. A ripple of whispers broke through the crowd. Lucas laughed low and dismissive. You are bluffing. Alina knelt, lifting the paper with slow precision. Am I? Her voice was calm, measured, dangerous. This agreement, she continued, proves that the man who stands here, pretending to be my judge, has his own sins to answer for. Lucas's jaw clenched. Alina let the next page slip from her fingers. Then another, and another, each one a record, a signature, a deal sealed in deception. A guest murmured, What is all that? Alina turned to the room. Proof of deals Lucas thought no one knew about. The guests turned to silence. Lucas stepped forward. You do not know what you are talking about. Alina held up a page, her voice unwavering. This contract, dated months before our engagement, a financial agreement between you and a third party, money transferred under conditions that would only benefit you if our marriage took place. A woman in the crowd whispered, a business deal? Alina nodded. A transaction disguised as love. Lucas's smile was gone. This is nonsense. Alina tilted her head. Is it? Because I have more. Another sheet floated to the floor. Lucas lunged forward, snatching at the papers. But it was too late. The weight of truth had already fallen, and the groom had become the accused. Alina Carter's voice did not shake. Each word was a precise cut, sharp enough to leave scars. Corruption. The crowd stiffened. Fraud. A gasp rippled through the room. Manipulation. Lucas Sterling's confident facade fractured just for a moment, but a moment was all she needed. Alina lifted another page from her stack. For those of you who still believe in the man standing beside me, allow me to illuminate the truth. Lucas scoffed. This is absurd. Alina turned toward him, her gaze steady. Absurd as thinking no one would find out. Lucas's lips curled into a forced smirk. Find out what? She held up the paper between her fingers. Shall we start with this? A prominent investor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Alina's voice remained calm. A fraudulent contract, forged under your name, redirecting company funds into private accounts. A man in the crowd murmured, impossible. Alina let another page fall to the floor. Bank statements, offshore accounts, money moved under names that do not exist. Lucas exhaled through his nose. This means nothing. Alina took a step forward. It means everything. A woman's voice rose above the whispers. Is this true, Lucas? Lucas turned toward the voice. You are going to believe her? She is desperate. Alina tilted her head. Desperate is how you describe those who came to you for help. You smiled at them, promised them security, and then drained them dry. The murmurs turned to accusations. A man in the back shouted, you took my company's investment, and you told me it failed. Lucas raised a hand. Enough of this. Alina did not stop. You made it fail. Another guest stood. Lucas, tell us this is a lie. Silence. Alina dropped the final page. Tell them. Lucas clenched his jaw, but the weight of the room had already shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. A hush fell over the crowd. The room, once humming with quiet amusement, now held a different kind of tension. Lucas Sterling, the man who had once commanded admiration, now stood at the center of something else entirely, uncertainty. A single voice sliced through the silence. Lucas, a man from the front row called out, is it true? Lucas's hands curled into fists. This is ridiculous. Alina did not blink. Deny it then. His lips parted, but no words came. The room shifted. The people who had stood by his side now exchanged wary glances. A woman near the back rose from her seat. We invested in you, trusted you. Lucas shook his head. You do not understand. Alina tilted hers. Then explain it. His pulse thundered. The weight of every eye bore down on him. A murmur rippled through the guests. Alina let the papers fall to the floor. You built a kingdom on deception, and now it is crumbling. Lucas swallowed hard. The walls were closing in. The silence stretched. The weight of truth had begun its slow suffocation of Lucas Sterling's world, but he was not a man who surrendered easily. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. The muscles in his jaw twitched. The glint in his eyes no longer carried amusement. It was something darker now. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, his voice barely above a whisper. You'll regret this, he said, the words brushing against her skin like a warning, like a promise. Alina did not flinch. She did not step back. Her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. No, Lucas, you will. The air in the room thickened. The shift had happened. For the first time in his life, Lucas Sterling was not the one holding the power. He could feel it slipping through his fingers, unraveling like a thread he could no longer control. A murmur rippled through the guests. The confidence that once shielded him had begun to crack. Alina took a step closer, her voice steady, deliberate. You thought I would break, that I would fall to my knees and beg for mercy, but you underestimated me. His breath hitched, barely noticeable, but Alina caught it. Do you feel it, Lucas? She asked, tilting her head slightly. The fear? The realization that you are not invincible? His fingers twitched, rage bubbling beneath the surface. You have no idea what you are doing, he hissed. You are playing a game you cannot win. Alina's smile did not waver. This is not a game. It never was. But you made the mistake of thinking you were the only one holding the cards. The murmurs around them grew louder. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. Others stood frozen, watching, waiting. A woman near the front crossed her arms. Lucas, what is she talking about? Another voice, sharp with doubt, followed. Is there truth to this? He turned sharply toward them. She is twisting everything. Alina raised an eyebrow. Am I? She reached into the folds of her gown, her fingers curling around yet another document. Lucas's throat bobbed. She held it up. Do you recognize this? A flicker of something, panic maybe, flashed across his face. Alina's voice did not waver. You forged deals in the dark, believing no one would see. You lied to the very people who placed their trust in you. His shoulders stiffened. Do you deny it? She asked. The seconds stretched. He said nothing. And silence, sometimes, is the loudest confession of all. The air in the ballroom had changed. What was once filled with laughter and admiration had curdled into something else. Uncertainty, tension, and the slow, creeping realization that the man they had once respected was no longer untouchable. Lucas Sterling's grip on power had begun to slip. A few guests exchanged wary glances. Others reached for their phones, capturing every second of the unraveling. A hushed voice whispered, "This is going to make headlines." Then came another, louder this time, "Is it true?" Lucas turned sharply, his eyes darting between the guests, searching for control. But it was gone. He could feel it slipping through his fingers, evaporating like mist under the weight of truth. He clenched his jaw. He could not let this happen. With slow, deliberate steps, he turned back to Alina. "This is slander," he spat, his voice dripping with desperation. "You think you can stand here and ruin me?" Alina's expression remained unshaken. She lifted her chin, voice steady. "I think you ruined yourself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone scoffed. "I never trusted him." Another voice followed, stronger, bolder. "Neither did I." Lucas's eyes flickered with something dangerous. He stepped forward, his voice low, sharp. "You do not know who you are dealing with." Alina did not move, did not blink. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Neither do you," she said. Lucas lunged forward. It was a mistake. Before he could reach her, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Sir, step back." Two security guards had appeared from the edges of the ballroom, their presence unmistakable, their stance firm. The room went still. A single moment stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, one of the guards placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Sir, we need you to leave." Lucas stiffened. "No one is going anywhere," he snapped. The guard did not flinch. That was not a request. A hush fell over the guests. Alina exhaled slowly, watching as the reality of the moment settled onto Lucas's face. For the first time in his life, he was being removed. Not honored, not respected, removed. His eyes darkened with fury. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Alina tilted her head, her gaze unshaken. "It is." The guards tightened their grip. And just like that, Lucas Sterling, the man who once held the room in the palm of his hand, was escorted out. The doors closed behind him, and the world shifted. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that came from peace, but the kind that followed a storm, the kind that carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Alina Carter stood at the center of it all, a wedding dress she would never wear down the aisle, a future that had just crumbled in front of hundreds of witnesses, and a man who once thought he controlled her fate now standing in disgrace. She did not feel broken. She did not feel defeated. She felt free. Lucas was gone, removed from the very event that was meant to celebrate his triumph. The man who once dictated the rules had lost. And Alina, she had rewritten them. She let out a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the room. Some guests avoided her eyes, too ashamed to face the woman they had once whispered about. Others looked on in quiet admiration, stunned by what they had just witnessed. One voice broke through the hush. "She is incredible." Another followed. "She was never the victim, she was the warrior." Alina turned to where her mother stood, her face lined with worry, but her eyes filled with something else, pride. Alina stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You are stronger than I ever knew," her mother whispered. Alina gave a small smile, one filled with understanding. "I had to be," she said. And then she turned, not in retreat, not in shame, but in absolute victory. Her steps were steady as she moved toward the grand entrance of the ballroom, the weight of the moment pressing into the floor beneath her feet. With every step, the whispers behind her grew louder. A voice, hushed but insistent, murmured. She walked away. She left him. Another, laced with quiet awe, added, "No, she won." The doors loomed ahead, a threshold between the past and what lay beyond. She reached for them. Then, just before she stepped through, she turned back one last time, not to see what she had lost, but to remember what she had conquered. And then, with her chin lifted and her heart steady, Alina Carter walked away, stronger than ever. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that held weight, the kind that carried judgment, regret, and disbelief. Alina Carter did not run. She did not stumble. She walked, slow, deliberate, unshaken. Gasps rippled through the grand hall as she passed, rows of stunned guests watching her every move. Some whispered in hushed voices, their eyes darting between her and the wreckage of the night. Others said nothing at all, frozen in the reality that had unfolded before them. She had been humiliated, betrayed, put on display for their amusement, and yet she was the one who stood victorious. Lucas Sterling had orchestrated her downfall, but he had underestimated the woman he thought he could break. At the far end of the ballroom, the door stood tall, her exit, her final act. She did not look back. Not at the man who had once held her hand with promises of forever, not at the guests who had expected tears instead of triumph, not at the carefully arranged chandeliers and lavish decor, all meant to celebrate a wedding that had become a scandal. Lucas's world had cracked. His business partners no longer whispered to him, but about him. His allies had become strangers. He had played his game, and he had lost. One step after another, Alina moved forward. The weight of the past lifted with every stride. A voice, barely above a whisper, reached her ears. She should have begged him to stay. Another, sharp and certain, countered. He should have never let her go. She let them talk. The woman they had pitied was no longer the woman standing before them. She reached the doors. A hand landed on her arm, firm, desperate. "Lucas." His fingers tightened as his voice dropped to a plea. "Alina, please." For the first time since she had exposed him, she turned. His once unshakable confidence had crumbled. His eyes, dark with frustration, searched hers, waiting for a sign of doubt, a crack in her resolve. There was none. She tilted her head, a quiet amusement dancing in her gaze. "Let go, Lucas." His grip hesitated, but he did not release her. "Do not walk away," he murmured, his voice raw with something that sounded like regret. But regret was a heavy thing to carry, and Alina had chosen to leave hers behind. Her voice was soft, yet sharp enough to cut. "I already did." With one effortless motion, she pulled her arm free. Lucas's hand fell away, empty, as if he had just lost the last thing that had ever truly mattered. Alina turned, her back to the man who had once thought he owned her. And then, with her head held high and her heart steady, she walked through the doors. She did not belong to this story anymore. She was writing her own. The moment she stepped beyond the ballroom doors, the world erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning in a storm. Reporters swarmed, their voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. The weight of countless eyes pressed in from every direction. They were not just covering a wedding anymore. They were witnessing history. Microphones were shoved toward her, a chorus of questions thrown at her all at once. Miss Carter, was this planned? Did you know about the documents before today? Are you pressing charges? She did not answer. She did not stop. The chaos followed her, but it did not touch her. Lucas had hoped to see her broken. But the woman walking away was anything but. Her heels clicked against the pavement, slow, deliberate. Each step sent a message, one the world would not soon forget. Her name, once whispered in private circles, was now a storm spreading across headlines. Alina Carter, the bride who walked away. Some called her fearless. Others called her reckless. But no one could look away. The flashes intensified, the air thick with the scent of scandal. Miss Carter, did you ever love him? The question cut through the noise, sharp and piercing. For the first time, she hesitated. Love? She had once believed in it, in promises in forever. But love without trust. Love without respect. That was not love at all. She turned her head slightly, meeting the reporter's gaze. Her voice, steady as stone, rang clear. No comment, because some answers were not meant for cameras. A black car pulled up to the curb, its presence a lifeline in the sea of flashing lights. A familiar voice called out, Alina. Sophia. Her closest friend, her anchor, the only one who had warned her about Lucas before it was too late. She did not hesitate. The car door opened and she stepped inside. The reporter surged forward, cameras fighting to capture every last second. The door shut, sealing her away from the madness. For the first time in what felt like hours, silence. Sophia exhaled, shaking her head. I told you he was hiding something. But this, I never imagined. Alina leaned back against the seat, her hands resting on her lap. I did. Sophia turned to her, surprise flickering in her eyes. You knew. Alina's gaze drifted to the window, watching as the ballroom faded into the distance. I suspected, but I needed proof. And tonight, she had gotten it. Lucas Sterling, the untouchable businessman, had been exposed, not just for his lies, but for the empire he had built on deception. The city skyline loomed ahead, glowing against the night sky. Somewhere in offices lit by late-night news reports, investors were pulling out. Legal teams were gathering. Lucas's world was crumbling. And Alina, she was walking away with her head held high. The car sped forward, leaving behind the wreckage of a wedding that was never meant to be. The story was no longer about Lucas Sterling's rise. It was about Alina Carter's rebirth. And the world was watching. Lucas stood frozen at the altar. The world around him was shifting, slipping from his grasp. Only moments ago, he had been in control, powerful, untouchable. Now he was drowning in whispers, in stares that once held admiration, but now carried something else. Doubt, suspicion, judgment. His name had commanded respect. His presence had demanded attention. But now he was just a man stripped bare before an audience that had come to celebrate his triumph and instead witnessed his downfall. He swallowed, his throat dry, his hands clenched at his sides, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed in on him, suffocating. The murmurs grew louder. What just happened? Did she really expose him at their own wedding? Is this real? The words stung, but nothing compared to the silence of those who once stood beside him. His business partners, the ones who had toasted to his success, now shifted uncomfortably, exchanging wary glances. The investors he had counted on whispered in hushed voices, some already reaching for their phones. And the press? The press would turn this into a feeding frenzy. His empire was built on perception, and that perception had just crumbled in front of everyone who mattered. A single night, a single woman, and everything he had built was now slipping through his fingers. He turned, desperate to find her, Alina. She was gone. The doors had closed behind her, and with her exit, his control vanished completely. He could feel it, the shift, the unspoken understanding that he was no longer the man of the hour. He was the story of the fall. Someone cleared their throat behind him. He turned sharply. It was Philip, one of his oldest allies, a man who had stood beside him through every deal, every calculated move. But the look in his eyes now? It was not loyalty. It was hesitation. "Lucas," Philip said, voice low, measured. "Tell me this is not true." Lucas inhaled sharply, forcing himself to straighten. "I can handle this," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "She is a problem?" Philip interrupted. "Or the only reason we know the truth?" The words were a knife to the gut. Lucas felt the air shift again, the crowd beginning to break apart. Some leaving, some staying just long enough to see what happened next. He looked for support, a familiar face, a voice to defend him. But all he found were backs turning, quiet departures, and the lingering weight of betrayal. The altar, the flowers, the music, it had all become a mockery of what was supposed to be the grandest night of his life. His jaw tightened. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had been careful. He had always been careful. Yet somehow, Alina had outplayed him. A bitter laugh nearly escaped him. The woman he had underestimated, the woman he had tried to control, had just dismantled his legacy in front of the world. And now he was left standing in the wreckage. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a lesson drilled into him since childhood. Power is perception. Lose that and you lose everything. He had never believed it more than he did at this moment. A security officer approached him, standing stiffly. "Sir," the man said, his voice unreadable, "we have been instructed to escort you out." The final blow. Lucas exhaled, slow and controlled, masking the rage boiling beneath the surface. "By whom?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The venue," the officer replied, "and the board of Sterling Enterprises." The words nearly stole the breath from his lungs. His own company, the very empire he had built, they had turned on him. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability. Lucas clenched his fists. A fall from grace. A name that once commanded fear, now met with silence. He had spent years ensuring he was untouchable. And in the span of a single evening, he had lost everything. The camera still flashed, capturing his downfall in real time. Headlines were already being written. Lucas Sterling, the king who fell. The security officer took a step closer. "Sir, it is time to go." Lucas exhaled. For the first time in his life, he had no choice. No control. No escape. He turned, stepping down from the altar that was supposed to mark his greatest victory. But tonight, it was not his triumph being remembered. It was hers, Alina Carter, the woman who walked away, and the man who lost everything trying to break her. As he walked past the remnants of what was supposed to be his perfect night, he understood one thing. Power was never about control. It was about who held the truth. And tonight, the truth had finally found him. The diamonds on her wrist caught the light, but they meant nothing now. The silk of her gown trailed behind her, but it was no longer a symbol of a future she had been forced to accept. Alina Carter had walked into this night as a bride, but she was leaving as something else entirely. Free. The whispers behind her faded into nothing. The gasps, the shock, the disbelief, it all melted away with every step she took. Lucas had thought she would be ruined without him. He had crafted a world where she needed him. But the only thing she had ever truly needed was this moment. The moment she chose herself. She reached her hands to her wrist and unclasped the bracelet. A priceless piece of jewelry, one of the many symbols of the life she had been expected to embrace. It slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the marble floor. Not hesitation, not regret. Relief. A hush spread through the guests still lingering near the entrance. She felt their stares, their questions hanging thick in the air. How did she walk away from this? Does she even realize what she is giving up? Alina almost smiled. They would never understand, because they had never stood where she stood. They had never felt the weight of chains wrapped in gold, disguised as gifts. They had never seen the price of wealth when it came with a contract that did not just bind your name, but your soul. She stepped through the doors and felt the air shift around her. Cool, open. For the first time in years, she could breathe. A voice called her name. She turned. Emma, her closest friend, the one person who had seen through it all. Emma exhaled, relief washing over her face. You did it. Her voice was barely a whisper. Alina nodded, a quiet victory in the simple movement. I should have done it sooner, she admitted. Emma glanced back toward the ballroom doors, where chaos still swirled behind the heavy walls. The world is going to talk about this for years. Alina lifted her chin. Let them. This was not a story of scandal. This was not the downfall of a bride who had lost her groom. It was the rise of a woman who had freed herself. She took another step forward, the weight she had carried for so long slipping away. Her family had expected her to be a trophy. Lucas had expected her to be obedient. But expectations were no longer her burden to carry. She was walking away from a life that had never been hers. And for the first time, she was walking toward one that was. A journalist nearby raised the microphone. Miss Carter, do you have a statement? Alina stopped. A statement? For years, she had been silent, a figure in the background of a story written by others. But now she held the pen. She turned toward the reporter, meeting the eyes of the world that was waiting for her to speak. And then, with quiet certainty, she said the only words that mattered. I am free. Then, without another glance back, she stepped into the night, not as a bride, not as a woman who had been left behind, but as Alina Carter, unshackled, unstoppable, and free. The night was far from over. By the time Alina Carter reached her waiting car, the world had already decided this was more than a wedding. This was a reckoning. The first headline hit before the door even closed behind her. Billionaire groom humiliated at the altar. Then another, Alina Carter's revenge. The notifications flooded her phone, messages pouring in from people she had not spoken to in years. Some were filled with shock, others admiration, and some were filled with fear. Fear that the truth would not just stay between her and Lucas. Fear that the world was about to learn everything. She glanced down at her hands, still steady, still strong. She had walked away, but the battle was not over. Emma, sitting beside her, let out a breath. You do realize this is going to be everywhere. Alina tilted her head slightly, watching the screens on the towering buildings outside. The breaking news banner scrolled across the mall. She exhaled, slow and measured. I know. Emma frowned, her voice cautious. Are you ready for that? Alina's gaze did not waver. I have been ready for a long time. For years, the world had seen her as nothing more than an accessory in Lucas Sterling's life. A perfectly crafted fiancée, a woman designed to be admired, but never truly seen. But now they were all watching. The cameras, the reporters, the people who had whispered behind closed doors, who had spoken of her in passing, as if she were merely a footnote in Lucas's story. They were watching her now, not as a bride, not as someone's future wife, but as the woman who had changed everything in a single night. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from someone unexpected. Her father. For years, he had spoken of duty, of responsibility, of what it meant to uphold a legacy. And now, just 2 words from him. Proud of you. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. Emma read the message over her shoulder. A soft smile. It is about time. The car slowed as they reached the entrance to the hotel. A crowd had already gathered. Photographers, journalists, people desperate to capture the next piece of the story. Alina lifted her chin, her fingers resting against the handle of the door. Emma hesitated. "You do not have to say anything." Alina met her gaze. "Yes, I do." The door opened and the world erupted. The flashes were blinding, the voices a blur of overlapping questions. "Alina, what happened inside? Was this revenge? Did you plan to humiliate Lucas?" She could have ignored them. She could have walked straight into the hotel and let the headlines speak for themselves. But that was not who she was anymore. She turned toward the cameras, let the noise settle just enough. Then, with unwavering calm, she spoke. This was never about revenge. The reporters leaned in, waiting, anticipating. This was about truth. She let the words settle, let them sink into the air. Then she walked forward, past the flashing lights, past the endless questions, past the weight of expectation that had once held her down. She had not just walked away from a man, she had walked into something greater. Her story. And the world was finally listening. Lucas Sterling had built an empire on control, and in a single night, he had lost it all. The murmurs had not stopped, the stares had not faded, and the weight of humiliation pressed down on him like a vice. Inside the grand ballroom, his hands shook as he gripped his phone. Fix this. That was the only thought pounding in his head. His voice was sharp, frantic. I need statements released immediately. A pause. His jaw tightened. No, not tomorrow. Now. The room still smelled of expensive champagne and fresh roses, yet everything about it felt rotten. The very people who had once sung his praises now whispered about his downfall. His most trusted allies avoided his gaze. His investors exchanged uncertain glances. Even the servers moved around him with careful distance. Lucas inhaled, trying to steady himself. He was not a man who lost. He had turned failures into victories before. This would be no different, or so he told himself. But the truth was a different kind of monster. Across the room, his business partner, Richard Calloway, adjusted his cufflinks with unsettling calm. Lucas approached him, forcing confidence into his steps. Richard, we need to control the media. I want a counter-story within the hour. Richard barely glanced at him. A counter-story? Lucas gritted his teeth. Yes, I will not be made a spectacle. We turned this against her. Richard let out a slow breath. Lucas, listen to yourself. You were caught, in front of everyone. There is no spin to this. A bitter chuckle escaped Lucas's throat. There is always a spin. Richard folded his arms. Not this time. Lucas clenched his jaw. You would throw away our deal because of one woman. Richard's lips curved slightly, but there was no humor in his expression. Not just one woman, the woman who exposed you. Lucas could feel it happening. His empire slipping through his fingers, his influence shrinking with every passing second. He glanced at the screens in the ballroom, where the news had already taken hold. Sterling empire in chaos. Lucas Sterling humiliated in public betrayal. He turned back to Richard, but the man had already walked away. Lucas's breath came in short bursts now. He swiped at his phone, calling another name. It rang. No answer. Another. No answer. Then another. Still nothing. He gritted his teeth, typing furiously. Messages sent. Unread. The world was moving on without him. Across the ballroom, his mother stood with perfect poise, sipping her wine, not a flicker of emotion on her face. Lucas stalked toward her. Say something. She tilted her head slightly. About what? His fingers curled into fists. You are really going to stand there like this is nothing? Her eyes met his, cold, calculating. It is nothing, Lucas, because you let it happen. His breath caught. His mother had never spoken to him like that. He had spent his whole life making sure she was proud of him. And now she looked at him as if he were weak. His voice was low. Dangerous. I will fix this. Her silence was deafening. For the first time in his life, she did not believe him. Lucas turned away, gripping his phone once more. He had one last move. If power would not protect him, money would. With a few swipes, he accessed his private accounts. A call to the press, a few payouts, a rewritten story. That was all it would take. But as he scanned the latest reports, his hand froze. One headline stood out among the rest. Alina Carter's truth, the woman who took down a king. Lucas's blood ran cold. He clicked on the article, his eyes scanning frantically. Not just rumors, not just scandal. Documents, evidence, contracts he had hidden away, now brought into the light. Alina had not just walked away tonight. She had walked away prepared. His last move, his desperation, meant nothing because she had already won. Lucas Sterling had spent his life controlling the narrative. But tonight, he was the story. The headlines would not be his triumph. They would be his downfall. From the backseat of her car, Alina Carter turned her head, eyes locked on the chaos she had left behind. Through the tinted glass, she saw him. Lucas, still standing at the altar, hands clenched, his world crumbling piece by piece. The guests had scattered into murmuring circles, their voices a low hum of scandal and speculation. His power had kept them silent for years. But power meant nothing now. Alina did not need to say a word. The smirk on her lips was enough. The driver cleared his throat. "Where to, Miss Carter?" She exhaled, fingers tracing the soft leather of the seat. For the first time in years, she had no script to follow, no expectations to meet, no role to play. "Where to?" "Anywhere but back." Her voice was calm. "Just drive." The car pulled away, rolling smoothly over the cobblestone driveway, leaving behind the glittering ballroom, the shattered reputation, the man who had underestimated her. Lucas had believed she would crumble. He had thought she would break. But the woman he tried to control had just rewritten the ending. Inside the ballroom, Lucas finally moved. His breath was uneven, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had she won? His fist slammed onto the nearest table, sending crystal glasses shattering to the floor. No one stopped him. No one dared to. He had spent a lifetime making people fear him. And now they watched with curiosity, with amusement, with something far worse than hate. Indifference. Richard Calloway, his longest-standing business ally, stepped forward. His voice was even. "Lucas." Lucas did not look up. Richard continued, "You should leave before this gets worse." Lucas's head snapped up. "Before this gets worse?" His voice was hoarse, filled with something unrecognizable. Richard nodded toward the exit. "She has already won. Do not give them more to talk about." Lucas scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "You think this is over?" Richard's eyes did not waver. "I think you know it is." Lucas's chest rose and fell, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. This could not be over. This was not how the story ended. He pulled out his phone, dialing furiously. There was still a way. A press statement, a carefully spun narrative. Money could erase this. Influence could bury it. He pressed the phone to his ear. It rang. Hand rang. And rang. Then, a voicemail. He tried another number. Another voicemail. His grip tightened around the device, the weight of defeat settling into his bones. Alina had not just walked away. She had prepared. She had anticipated. She had outplayed him in every possible way. His power had always come from being 10 steps ahead, but she had just taken the entire board. Lucas swallowed the bitter truth. Alina Carter was no longer just the woman who walked away. She was the woman who left him behind. Lucas adjusted his cufflinks, the smirk returning to his lips. The worst was over. Alina was gone. The scandal would fade. And he would survive. His fingers tapped against his watch, a silent countdown to the moment when this nightmare would be nothing more than a passing whisper. His empire would stand. His name would endure. Or so he believed. Lucas exhaled, rolling his shoulders, a practiced motion. a man regaining control. He had been blindsided before, but power was not in avoiding disaster. It was in rewriting the story afterward. His voice was even as he spoke. "Call my team. Damage control starts now." Richard Calloway, his most trusted advisor, hesitated before reaching for his phone. Lucas noticed. A pause, a hesitation that did not belong. His eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem?" Richard cleared his throat. "There is an issue." Lucas frowned. "With Alina." Richard shook his head. "Not Alina." Lucas's jaw clenched. He had anticipated Alina's move, but this? Something else. A knot formed in his stomach. The feeling was unfamiliar, unease. Richard's voice was measured, but his words were sharp. "There are others." Lucas scoffed. "Others?" He took the slow step forward, voice dropping. "What does that mean?" Richard hesitated again. "Your past. It is catching up." Lucas's smirk faltered. For the first time all night, he felt something deeper than frustration. He felt vulnerability. His past? No. He had buried it, silenced it, paid to erase it. Yet Richard's expression told him otherwise. Lucas inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the nearest table. "Who?" Richard hesitated before handing over his phone. One name, one message, one new enemy. Lucas read the text once, then twice. The words were simple, but the meaning was devastating. "You thought Alina was your reckoning. You were wrong. Your sins did not die in silence." A chill ran down his spine. This was not Alina. This was someone else. Someone who knew. Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had always been the predator, always the one pulling the strings. But tonight, he was the hunted, and the game had only just begun. The murmurs in the ballroom quieted. Something had changed. Not in words, not in movement, but in the air. Lucas felt it before he saw it. The weight of a presence, a familiar presence. His breath caught, his fingers tightening against his cufflinks. Then he saw him, emerging from the back of the room, unrushed, unshaken, unstoppable. The guests sensed it too, a shift in energy, a sudden awareness. All eyes followed the figure, tall, commanding, a ghost stepping out of the shadows of Lucas's past. Lucas's stomach twisted. His mind screamed for an explanation. It was not possible. Yet there he stood. The past had found him. The man did not break eye contact. He did not waver. Lucas, for the first time tonight, felt something new. Not frustration, not anger, fear. He forced himself to blink, to breathe. This was a trick, a power move. Someone sent him. Lucas straightened, masking his unease with a forced smirk. "Interesting choice of an entrance," he murmured, voice low. The man smiled, not warmly, not kindly, with knowing. "I thought it was fitting," he said, voice smooth, measured. Lucas's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the guests watching, whispering, waiting. Richard took a cautious step forward. "Mr. Kane," he whispered, "we were not expecting." The man, Elliot Kane, held up a hand. The room froze, a name most had forgotten, but not Lucas. Lucas had tried to forget, had paid to forget. And yet, Elliot Kane had returned. Lucas inhaled sharply. "No," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Elliot tilted his head. "No," he echoed. Lucas clenched his jaw. "This is not real." Elliot's smile widened. "Oh, Lucas," he sighed, "you should know better than anyone. Everything catches up eventually." Lucas's fingers curled into fists. His empire, his control. It had taken a hit tonight, but this was war. He took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "What do you want?" Elliot exhaled, as if amused by the question. "What do I want?" He gestured toward the ballroom, toward the chaos still settling. You know, Lucas, I was going to wait, but I could not resist. Not after watching what Alina just did to you. Lucas's teeth clenched. Elliot knew. He had been watching, waiting. Lucas's chest burned with frustration, but beneath that, beneath the pride, beneath the composure, lurking deep in his gut, dread. Because if Elliot was here, if he had stepped out of the shadows tonight, then that meant. Lucas swallowed hard. There was more to come. Elliot leaned in slightly. The power between them had shifted, and Lucas knew it. Tonight was just the beginning, Elliot murmured. Lucas held his ground. He refused to break. Not in front of his guests, not in front of the man he had betrayed, the man whose revenge had only just begun. The weight of the room had shifted. Lucas Sterling had spent years mastering control, a ruthless businessman, a calculated predator, a man who built his empire on the broken backs of others. But now his empire was crumbling. The whispers had turned into a storm, and the truth was no longer a secret. Someone had waited for this moment. Someone who knew exactly how to end him. Lucas clenched his jaw, scanning the room. He could feel it. A presence, a force stronger than fear. Elliot Kane had returned, and with him, the past. Lucas had buried too many skeletons, but some refused to stay in the ground. Elliot stepped forward, his voice calm, almost amused. It is funny, is it not, Lucas? How the mighty always think they are untouchable. Lucas's fingers twitched against his cufflinks. He forced a smirk. You have a talent for dramatics, Elliot. Elliot tilted his head. Oh, but you would know all about drama, would you not? You have destroyed enough lives to produce an entire show. The crowd was listening now. A name that had once disappeared from business circles had returned, louder than ever. Elliot Kane, the man Lucas had erased. Or so he thought. Lucas exhaled sharply. What is your point? Elliot smiled. That you are about to learn what it feels like to lose. Lucas's patience snapped. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Revenge? That is what this is. Elliot's eyes darkened. No, this is justice. Lucas chuckled dryly, shaking his head. You think you can take me down? Elliot leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Oh, Lucas, he said, I already have. Lucas's smirk faltered. A vibration against his wrist, his phone. An alert, then another, and another. Something was wrong. Lucas's stomach twisted as he pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands tightened around the device. The headlines. Breaking news. Lucas Sterling under investigation for fraud and corruption. Former associates step forward. Allegations of blackmail and coercion. His vision blurred. His empire was on fire. This was not possible. He had built his walls too high, planned too perfectly. Yet, here it was. The price of the life he had lived. The room began to spin. He looked up. Elliot was still there, still watching, still waiting. Lucas's voice was barely a whisper. What have you done? Elliot exhaled as if he had been waiting for this question. What he never saw coming, he said. Lucas's hands trembled. He could hear the murmurs growing louder. His name, once spoken with respect, was now uttered with disgust. His allies, silent. His enemies, victorious. The man who crushed others had finally been crushed. Lucas Sterling had always believed in one truth. Power meant control. And control meant he was untouchable. But at this moment, with his empire on fire, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. A number he had not seen in years. His hands hovered over the screen, hesitating. A feeling, one he was unfamiliar with, crept in. Dread. He swallowed hard and pressed accept. Silence. Then a voice, smooth, cold, almost amused. Lucas, A name spoken without fear. Lucas straightened his shoulders, forcing a smirk. Who is this? A low chuckle. Oh, come on, you already know. His blood ran cold. He did know. His fingers gripped the phone tighter. It was a voice from a past he had buried. Elliot, Lucas whispered. The man on the other end exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. You always thought you were above consequences. Lucas's jaw tensed. You think you can scare me? A beat of silence. Then, it is over. Two words that hit harder than a bullet. Lucas's pulse pounded in his ears. The world tilted. His empire, his legacy, his wealth, gone. He forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. You expect me to believe that? Elliot's voice was calm, unshaken, absolute. I do not expect anything, Lucas, but by now you should check the news. Lucas's hand trembled as he pulled up his phone screen. Breaking news. Lucas Sterling's fortune crumbles amidst corruption allegations. Sterling Enterprises stock plummets. CEO Lucas Sterling under investigation. The headline screamed at him. His throat tightened. This was not happening. He tapped into his financial accounts. Error. Locked. His money was gone. His business seized. Lucas's voice cracked. You have no idea what you have done. Elliot's reply was effortless. No, Lucas, you have no idea what you have done. The line went dead, and for the first time in his life, so did his empire. Lucas Sterling was a man who thrived on control. Until now, his empire was collapsing, his fortune vanishing, and the woman he thought he owned gone. No cameras followed her. No trails were left behind. Alina Carter had disappeared, and the world was desperate to know, was this her plan all along? Lucas sat in his office, his head in his hands. The murmurs outside his door were growing. Employees whispering, journalists calling, shareholders demanding answers. His jaw clenched. He grabbed his phone, dialed, straight to voicemail. Again, nothing. Alina had always been meticulous, but this was surgical. Lucas turned to his assistant. Where is she? His voice was sharp, desperate. The assistant hesitated. Sir, we do not know. No flights, no records, no sightings. Lucas slammed his fist against the desk. Impossible. She could not have just vanished. The assistant swallowed. But she did. Lucas's fingers tightened around his phone. He had underestimated her. But this was not over. It was never over. He made another call. Find her. A pause. Sir, we already tried. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. She planned this. It was not a question. It was a revelation. And suddenly he saw it. The precision, the timing, the strategy. This was never about escaping. This was about winning. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Sterling was the one being played. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roasted coffee through the quiet morning air. Alina sat at a small cafe, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup. A different city, a different life, and soon a different name. No cameras followed her. No whispers trailed behind. For the first time in years, she was invisible. A waiter approached. Another cup. His voice was polite. Alina lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. No, thank you. Her voice was steady, controlled. The waiter hesitated, as if sensing something beneath her calm demeanor. Then he walked away. She turned to the window, watching strangers pass by. No one knew her here, and yet she felt more seen than ever. Lucas Sterling's empire had crumbled, but hers? It was just beginning. A dim light flickered overhead, casting shadows across the empty room. Lucas sat alone, his hands resting on the table, fingers trembling. The silence was unbearable. Then, a soft knock at the door. No words, just the sound of an envelope sliding across the floor. Lucas hesitated. A sudden chill crept through his veins. His instincts screamed at him to leave it untouched. But he had no choice. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for the envelope. His breath hitched. No return address. No markings. Only his name, written in precise, familiar handwriting. He swallowed hard, his pulse pounding as he tore the seal. A single sheet of paper. Just 2 lines. You should have known better. The words blurred as his vision swayed. His body went rigid. His past had finally caught up with him. A story of love, a story of power, a story of redemption. From the highest peaks of wealth to the coldest depths of betrayal, Lucas thought he controlled everything. But in the end, power was never his to keep. Alina vanished without a trace, yet her presence lingers, a whisper in the night, a name no one forgets. The past has a way of catching up. The truth has a way of surfacing. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction. It is walking away, leaving nothing but echoes behind. But is this truly the end? Maybe somewhere in another city, another life, another story. Fate is already writing its next chapter. And if you love stories of power, second chances, and justice, subscribe. Because this was just the beginning.